How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Living Streams podcast. Today, I am joined by Pastor David Stockton. This is the first time we've been able to hunt him down and get him in the studio. So today's going to be fun, David. I'm really excited you're here.
Yeah, should be fun.
So I just learned right before we went on air that you've actually done this before. You've been a part of a radio program in, when was that? I want the backstory because I'm super curious.
I was part of a church in Southern Oregon called Applegate Christian Fellowship, and they had their own radio station. They had bought one called K-Apple.
Love it.
And they were desperate for show airtime, so they let me and two other youth pastors have our own show. And so I don't really remember what we did. It was not real well planned out, and it was probably not well received either, but we had a lot of fun talking to people, prank calling people. So.
I love it.
Yeah.
I think we should invest in that. We should we should think about maybe doing a radio program of our own,
That'd be good.
Something a little weird. But today I would love to talk to you about kind of what the Lord's been doing in Living Streams for the last year or so, kind of get a little year in review. Yeah. And then I would love to kind of segue out of that into more of the other hours. I know you kind of coined that phrase earlier on in the year that the Lord doesn't want to make us good at church. He wants to make us good at life. And so I would love to talk about kind of what you're experiencing in your own life, what God's doing in you in the 167 hours that you spend outside of church, although you do spend a little bit more time than most people in church, considering that you're the senior pastor of this organization.
Yeah.
So just sort of tell me a little bit about this year, kind of what the journey's been from other hours now to church around the table and then beyond. Yeah,
basically, as we prayed and prepared for 2019, the big theme was family. I mean, Family Strong was kind of an idea that came to the surface of all of our ideas, and as we prayed into it and kind of thought into it and just really tried to create along those lines, that was the premise. And so we broke up, that phrase "Family Strong" first into trying to identify what family meant, and we really ended up liking the word household a lot better, just because not everybody has a family in the sense of multiple people living in their house. Some people are single, some people live with roommates, and so we really felt like household was a good word to include everybody, and the place where they call home, the place where they interact with people the most, and for a lot of people, family does fit. But we spent the first half of our year really focusing on the actual nuclear family that people have. So the family of origin that they came from, the family that they currently have, whether they're married or have kids, their current family relationships with siblings and parents if they're adults, and just kind of really trying to get people to think through those things. We did our Origins of Innocence series. That was part of the beginning of the year. Our fasting season was all about that same concept, generational type stuff, and so we did a lot of work there. It was very educational for me in preparing and actually going through it. We have some of the people on staff that, that's been where they've spent a lot of their time learning and growing, and it was fun to have their input. But overall, it was just a great season around that concept, and that's also where the other hours reality came in, because we knew for people, church is only 1 hour a week for a lot of people as far as the gathering in the name of the Lord, all of that. Hopefully there's some one-on-one time with the Lord and that going on besides there. But we did want to speak to the other hours. So, family dynamics, work relationships, work dynamics. We talked about rest as a part of that other hours. And so we kind of filled up that first half of the year with those concepts. But then the second half of the year, we've really focused on church as family. So Family Strong in the sense of who are you in your relationships, who are you in your family, who are you outside of your church concept, and really helping the Lord speak into those things, education, all of that. And then this second half, we've really said, okay, now let's talk about the church as a family, because legitimately the Bible calls the church a family, brothers and sisters in Christ. It's what God's been trying to do from the beginning. And then we have this reality that most of us, at least the people who are hearing our messages, actually go to a church and interact with people, and that that regard, and we wanted that to be strong as well. So family strong on the nuclear thing. What kind of roadblocks, what kind of generational curses potentially are there? What work have you just kind of put to the side, and what work are you willing to bring to the forefront of your lives to develop? Make sure your household or your family is strong.
Yeah.
And then as far as church goes, what's your history? What's your experiences? What kind of baggage do you have there? What's the concept for the church that God has, and how far off are we at this point?
Yeah.
And in hopes that our church family and people's vision of what the church can be becomes real strong.
Totally.
And valuable. So that's our year.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk about that first section first. The other hours, where did that phrase or that idea come from for you? Is that something that's kind of been stirring in you for, I'm sure, longer than just the last year?
Yeah. Working at a church, there's a lot of confusion. As when are you working as a Christian, and when are you just being a Christian?
Right.
Sometimes, like right now, my job is to do discipleship. My job is to create moments of encounter with the Lord for myself and others. My job is all those things. But then as soon as I stop working, like as a Christian, that's what I'm supposed to be doing as well. And so the lines can get a little blurry sometimes. And then as far as, family dynamics, at what point am I doing something that, is helping my family because it's my church job, and what point am I just doing it because I'm the dad I'm the husband? And so there's that reality, that ambiguity that can be there sometimes. I'm always trying to draw those lines really well. And then, reading the book by John Mark that we put out there, Garden City, to deal with work and rest and that divide. I think he actually was quoting somebody, but he talked about how pastors oftentimes spend so much time talking to their people and teaching their people how to be good at this 1 hour a week or 1 hour a day. Let's say you spend an hour a day with Jesus, which would be incredible. That's a good chunk of time. Probably all could do that. But there's so much more to life. And so that's where I started thinking we do need to talk to people about other related issues. And I don't know, the other hours, I don't know, Stranger Things, maybe that's where it came from, or I'm not sure what it is, but I say things a lot, and then Ryan Romeo, who's our creative arts director, he's like, ooh, bam, and he'll grab that and then create a whole, brand or world around it. But he liked the sound of that. And again, I don't know exactly why we called it, but it does. It makes a lot of sense, and it speaks volumes with just a couple of words. So.
And I think it does really speak to a pain point that people are experiencing in society that are Christians. And we've talked about this in the podcast for. Gosh, we renamed the podcast The Other Hours because we liked it so much. But that idea of the sacred and secular divide, and how the church has wrestled for centuries over this idea of
absolutely.
Does what I'm doing matter? Is it important to the kingdom of God, or is it just this little finite amount of time over here that I'm spending doing churchy things? And I think you did a really great job breaking that down and saying, no, that divide that you see actually doesn't exist. All of life is sacred because of the work of Jesus embodying.
And that phrase, God doesn't want to make you good at church. That's the last thing he's worried about. He wants to make you good at life. I mean, that was our big key driving phrase for all of that, and try and break that paradigm that God's only interested in these few sacred moments inside of cathedral or something. It's just not at all the God that the Bible talks about.
Totally.
He's wild and he's out there.
I mean, absolutely. Yeah. What's it been like in your own life? I mean, preaching those sermons, that was a long series, and you addressed 6 different topics or something like that over the course of that period of time. Was there a particular topic that you struggled the most with in terms of in your own personal life, as well as maybe ones that were a little bit harder to relate to? I know it's hearkening back a couple of months, but as you think back on The Other Hours, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, definitely the one that I think stood out the most, and not necessarily for me, but the one that seemed to resonate with people the most was the concept of rest. Yeah. And I think I'm the youngest of 3 boys, and so I just watch them, and when they do stupid things, I think, I'm probably not going to do that. So I've had the benefit of that. And then to some extent, watching other pastors, I've always kind of been the youngest in the room for a while. I'm not that way anymore. I'm starting to get a little old, but I've just watched pastors, and I remember being in a pastors group early on. I was probably like 19 years old, 20 years old. Oh no, sorry, this wasn't. I was 17 when I first started pastoring, but that was just with kids.
Yeah.
But it was when I was at Living Streams. I was probably 23 or 24, and I was with a group of pastors, and they were going around the room, and every one of them was describing what's happened since their breakdown. And I just thought, no thanks. And when it finally came to me, I was the last one. I said, well, I'm just kind of, buying time until my breakdown, it sounds like. And they all kind of laughed and moaned at the same time. And then Mark Buckley, who's the founding pastor of Living Streams, kind of been definitely a spiritual father for me. And just watching how he himself had breakdown, and he himself didn't learn the art and benefit of rest until after his breakdown. And then he's been able to preach that pretty well, but trying to apply those concepts preventively instead of reaction based on breaking down. So it's just been a big part of what I've tried to incorporate in my life and learn the lessons and apply them before things get bad. I hope it's not because I'm lazy, but you never know. But yeah, so then when we were really bringing that to the forefront, especially in our society, I mean, living in Belize and Gales Point in particular, which you've lived in as well, I mean, I learned what neutral felt like. And I learned that my entire life I'd done fifth gear and I'd done fourth gear on vacation. And there all of a sudden I was living in neutral, and my soul experienced things that it had never experienced before as far as rest. So yeah, that concept hit people in Phoenix, Arizona, in the 5th largest city or whatever it is nowadays.
Yeah.
And the phrase that I use for that a lot is Phoenix has a gravity that pulls us into superficial and artificial busyness, where we can go through any season of our life from a year to 5 years to 10 years and realize we've only been existing, we haven't been doing any living. Yeah. And that's what happens when you're revved up and wound up, and you don't have those moments of neutral, that you don't really take good stock or assessment, and you don't even know if you're heading in the direction you even want to head. Yeah. So that hit people well, along with that same book, Garden City. I think it was just a really strong concept that came out of kind of the history and heart of Living Streams, wanting to be a healthy local church. Yeah, absolutely. But then also in the midst of our society that, basically says if you're busy, you must be important. And really trying to deconstruct that and say, no, you're important if you're doing important things, not if you're doing a lot of things. So, that stuck out to me and resonated with me, even though that's been my mantra
right
for a while.
Right. Well, I think I'm not 100% sure if I'm quoting this right, but I think it was Einstein that said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, right? And I think that I really love how you kind of picked up on that concept and like, all right, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to see that breakdown happen. Yeah. Have you modified the way that you're living your life even now post Gales Point in terms of rest as a result of just kind of refreshing your mind on those concepts?
I think the biggest modification for me, I don't know how much I've changed, but I know that I value that rest, and I consider that being productive time. Whereas before, you feel guilty about it, or you're not sure if it's really that productive. I heard a story about, I don't know if it's like the guy who founded Ford or GMC. Yeah. It was some big car company. They said that in his schedule, he had every day he had an hour of window time. And what that meant is that was an hour every day where he would just stare out the window and kind of let his mind just churn over everything. Right. But it was scheduled time because whatever happened in that process of the mental kind of churning and churning ended up causing him to sit with those ideas long enough to where whatever ones kind of came to the forefront were probably the priority, and some things would subside. And so I think, you know, being in Belize and just seeing what God did in my own family, my own heart, when I think of the Sabbath principles in the scripture, especially in the reality of diminishing returns.
Yeah.
So if you work the same field 7 years in a row versus giving it a time off, you have to work just as hard to get less, which scares the crap out of me, or you have to work harder just to maintain what you already had, because there's diminishing returns at what point. And so I think there's a principle in there, and I mean in the Ten Commandments, that God's trying to teach us that there's rhythms and there's efficiency realities, and so just trusting those and applying those. And I always feel like every time I do it, I'm getting away with it, like I'm stealing something. But so far in the practice of my life, we're real big on Saturday is my Sabbath, basically sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, because once the sun goes down on Saturday, I start to freak out because I know I got to preach in the morning.
And now you got 3 services in the morning.
And I'm trying to finish up crafting the message, and so. But if I give myself that time Friday evening to Saturday evening, then I really do feel free to just not do things, you know, plug my phone in and not pay attention to it, and try and really go play in my kids' world, which is so exhausting and hard to do for a long time, but it really does reframe my brain in a lot of ways. And then, I mean, we've had this practice so far of every 6 years we quit our job and go to Belize for a year, and don't know how much more we'll get away with that, but but what seems like a detrimental thing has actually worked in the exact opposite.
Right.
And it's been beneficial not just for us, but our entire community.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, rest.
I love it.
It's godly.
Yep. I think that was the standout topic, I think, for almost everybody. And we didn't write a specific study guide or anything like that on rest. It kind of got lumped in with Garden City and the concept of occupation. But, I mean, still to this day, I have people come up to me all the time saying, like, that whole series was so good, and I'm just really being challenged in that area. And even my wife and I've said this in previous podcasts, but we've really... that's changed our paradigm of the way that we view productivity, and kind of shifting from like that. I think John Mark Comer says like the Egyptian system of like continuing to work without, continue to produce, even if you don't have the resources to do so, and beginning to enter into rest, which results in fruitfulness. And that's been something that's really challenged me personally.
Slavery.
Yeah. So, but moving on from the other hours, so we had a little brief period of time where we did some other stuff, and then we launched into the season in the fall. And I really appreciate that something you and the rest of the leadership at Living Streams do is really seek the Lord for what we might lack in terms of the way that we're doing church and the way that God's heart is for his body to be in health. And I think the thing that you identified this year was experiencing church outside of church. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
And so we launched into this series this fall called Church Around the Table, and launched life groups and all that kind of stuff too. And you said something on your final message a couple weeks ago that series, Church Around the Table, was the most impactful series that you've done. Is that correct?
Yeah. I don't know if I said that, but I did emphasize how much work had been done in my own soul through this particular passage. And that wasn't even intended. I mean, our concept was church around a table. And so we did want to really make sure people had a vision for the church that is supposed to happen outside of church, being the Sunday morning 1 hour or whatever that people have. And but really, as we kind of unpacked what church was supposed to be, even though I've been at this game for 17 years or 25 years, since I was 17, just spending time around the Lord's Supper, because that was the church around Jesus' table, and his teachings of in those moments of giving body and blood. Here, I'm giving my body and my blood for you, in the sense of now I want you to go and give your body and your blood to others, and this is really what is the church. And then, as Jesus and John's perspective was, he didn't talk about the body and blood, but he talked about washing of the feet.
Yeah.
And as I'm serving you and cleansing you and washing you in this way, I want you to go into this world and clean the dirty people. I don't know. Once again, it just hit me deep,
Yeah.
The compassion of the Lord, Tattoos on the Heart, that book. I know you've read it, but that boundless compassion and just being inspired by the love of Christ once again, that he was willing to give body and blood, not just on the cross, even though that was the end all be all ultimate sacrifice. He had been giving body and blood from the time he came. He's been giving body and blood since the beginning of creation and time, and that he really does want me to give that. And my wife is awesome in a million ways, and she's very willing to sacrifice for those who are overlooked or ignored. And so we've been in situations where we would be giving body and blood, especially in Belize, and and then having different people live with us in our own home, and we're in a particular situation where right now we feel like a lot of body and blood is being taken from us. And we've been whiny, and we've been upset, and we've felt things that don't feel like Christ would want us to feel. And so I think in the face of what we're experiencing right now, Jesus was just kind of softening and reorienting my heart and taking away some of those rough edges to just go, hey, it's, you feel like body and blood is being taken from you because you're doing something I've asked you to do. But what I want you to do is I want you to give body and blood because I've given to you.
Yeah.
And so trying to take it from look how much body and blood is being taken from us, to really being in a position where our hearts are saying, like, we want to give body and blood and are willing to for however long it takes. And so I'm not saying it worked, but it Jesus really was trying to work on this old heart, that sometimes I think, I've learned those lessons, and it wasn't that I was learning a new lesson. I was learning the very first lesson, but I was learning it deeper in my soul than ever before.
Yeah. What role have having the boys living with you, how has that kind of shaped that whole revelation that you've kind of been receiving this season?
The boys we have 2 foster boys that have been with us over a year, and I have 3 daughters as well. And I mean, these boys who are living with us definitely have need. That their family is not strong. And it is interesting. It just dawned on me now that Family Strong, like the year that we're doing Family Strong is the year that my wife and I got licensed and started fostering. It's kind of interesting. The Lord has a way of teaching us all the time. It just dawned on me. It's funny. But yeah, they have a lot of need, and no matter how much we give, it never seems to satisfy. It never seems to create any gratitude. And it's not because they're bad kids or whatever. It's just they've got so much neglect and so much need and so much brokenness that the body and blood we give is just so, it's like a little drop in the bucket. And ultimately what they need is they need Christ. And it's been cool because I think they both have a relationship with Jesus to some extent. One of them was baptized, the older one.
Yeah.
And yet our prayer all along is that their family would get strong, that their mom would get strong, and it looks like some of that's happening. The DCS is changing some of the story about what they say about their mom, and there's a real good chance that they're going to be able to go home to a healthy mom and all that. So that's incredible and good. Right. But yeah, that's been a great teacher for us. These little boys have taught us so much.
I believe it.
We were supposed to be teaching them, but they taught us a lot more.
Isn't that how it always goes?
Yeah.
David, something that I've always really respected about you is that you 100% practice what you preach. And I know that's kind of hard for you to hear sometimes, you know what I mean? But I think that this is all the stuff we've been talking about this for this last year is deeply rooted in what the Lord's doing in your own heart.
Yeah.
And I mean, we started off the year and we were talking about this idea of church around the table. And when I heard that phrase, I immediately was just like, okay, we're talking about community. We're talking about life groups, experiencing church outside of the normal context, which we definitely talked about. But when did this kind of revelation about the body and blood and kind of rereading, John 13 with this kind of new understanding of, okay, yeah, the church around the table that we're actually talking about is that place of, on the night that Jesus was betrayed. When did that kind of come to you, or what was the process there?
Again, that was we had our lessons all lined up for church around the table. I think we had 6 weeks or maybe 8 weeks. And, we want to talk about the book of Acts and their concept of church around the table, daily breaking bread, house to house. We want to talk about the power of that and how the Roman Empire was basically flipped upside down by the power of church around the table. We wanted to talk about the Lord's Supper. And, really it was just kind of out of nowhere as I started studying into those concepts. And in particular, the Last Supper, that moment of Jesus sitting around a table with his disciples and just trying to mine that and get deeper in there and sit there in my mind and hear those words afresh and what was Jesus trying to communicate. I don't know exactly how, the depth and power of what the Lord was showing me became so fresh, but it did, and it was just in my study time.
Yeah.
I was thinking I was going to teach something I already knew, but then as I studied it, it was like the Lord was teaching me brand new. Yeah. And and I think probably the backdrop of our own life and our own home and our own table, and most of the you say I practice what I preach. I married Brittany, and so she definitely is my greatest teacher, and partially because of the way that she lives and learns, and partially because of the stuff she pulls me into.
Which that was surprising for me to learn. When I first started getting to know you and Brittany more, I always thought that you were
the crazy one.
No, absolutely. You're tame in comparison. Because I always thought that you were kind of like the more missional, community oriented guy, and you totally are. But definitely a lot of that's come from Brittany's heart for the overlooked and the neglected.
Everything cool we've done is her fault. I get credit for it, but it's her.
Right. So, that was one of the first things when we started hanging out a couple of years ago. One of the first things I noticed is you did this thing on Sunday nights where you'd have family dinner and you'd have all these people come around. And that was so bizarre to me because I grew up in a pretty awesome family, honestly. As I look back now that I'm older, I'm like, man, my family did an amazing job. But it was pretty much, you looked at our table, it was, me, my parents, my sister, sometimes my grandpa. It wasn't this huge community experience. And what I experienced at your house that was so revolutionary to me was there was freaking 20-foot table going on, and there's all these people and dogs and kids, and it's just chaos. But there was something so beautiful about that I'd never really experienced before. How was that cultivated? Was that an intentional choice? I know there's a lot of things that have happened in your life circumstantially that have resulted in you having this community around you, but how have you cultivated that?
Yeah, that would probably go to Brittany's mom, Gabrielle Moselle. The Moselle family as a whole has, experienced their own challenges, and yet Gabrielle has been a mom who's followed the Lord and leaned into the Lord and said yes to the Lord, and God has been a great father and husband to her in the gaps, and she's the envy of a lot of grandparents now, living in such close proximity to her grandkids, and the family dinner thing was just her attempt to try and keep her family together, and they all come, the 4 siblings. And then they bring their families now. Yeah. But then, I'd say Brittany, and I think my heart too is, now that we have this wealth of family, it's just really fun to invite somebody over because they're just going to get caught up in it all. Yeah. And maybe be freaked out because there's all the animals and all the people and all the kids
and the baby goat for a little while.
But it's a breath of fresh air, I think, for people again who live in a city and and what the city's trying to shape us and mold us into, you know, it can be soul stripping, and it can leave us a little cold and lonely if we're not careful. So right there in the middle of the city, for there to be this, you know, basically kibbutz type situation it's refreshing, you know. And but Gabrielle's the one that makes sure it happens, and I mean, it's been going on for years.
Yeah.
But we just get to invite people into the wealth and strength. Totally. Which I love doing.
Well, I think it's just a beautiful picture of kind of what we're getting at. There's another book that we both have really enjoyed this last year, which is, Gospel Comes with House Key by Rosaria Butterfield. And as I was reading and I was flipping through those pages, I was just envisioning your backyard and all those people gathered around. And that's really, I mean, for me personally, that's been the thing that's landed the hardest. Out of all the messages this year, it's like, I really look forward to that and figure out ways to cultivate that that aren't, you know, I don't own a home yet, you know what I mean? And I don't really have a place where we can necessarily invite people in, but finding spaces where that can happen and that are outside of the normal context of an actual physical table. And I think you brought up the idea of like church around food stamps and church around like all these different stories that you brought up that you've encountered the Lord in. How would you define that idea of church around a table? What kind of, I mean, you shared a couple experiences on Sunday morning, but do you have more insight into that?
I mean, church around the table is just, you know, making the moments. I shared on the Sunday about this pastor who was talking about, he lives in New York City, and so he gets dropped off at Chick-fil-A, right next to Chick-fil-A, because it's right by his office. So when he Ubers or gets a Lyft, he's like, hey, can you take me to the Chick-fil-A on blah, blah, blah. And so the guy takes him there, and he said this one time, for whatever reason, he was with a guy who was driving him, and the guy who was driving him definitely looked like an immigrant from another part of the world, and so he'd normally just kind of let things be. You know, I don't know if he speaks English, so whatever. I'm in a hurry. I'll do some text. But this time, for whatever reason, he just decided that this guy was someone he wanted to talk to, and so he asked the guy, "Have you ever had a chicken sandwich from Chick-fil-A?" And the guy said no, and he goes, "Can I be the first to introduce you to the Chick-fil-A original chicken sandwich?" And the guy said yes. So then he goes, "Well, hold on." He said, "Keep the meter running. I'm going to pay for it. Let me go get you Chick-fil-A, and then we'll come back." So we went and got him, comes back, and then just sat in the car with him as they both ate a Chick-fil-A sandwich, talked to him, found out the guy was a doctor where he was from, but he couldn't get any paperwork, so that's why he's having to drive the cab. He's got 3 kids. The guy was like, "Well, I have 3 kids." And so it was like this moment of true church happened where these two people were loving on each other, we're getting to know each other, we're breaking through some barriers, we're creating moments of hospitality, and ultimately, you know, a chance to say, you know, this is who I am, I love Jesus, you know, what do you think about Jesus, whatever it might be. But just creating those moments, and they can happen anywhere, you know, and obviously it's nice to have a family dinner concept that someone else cooks the food for and pays for it. But again, that's where that line, like, that's not a part of my job. That's not that, whether I worked at, you know, insurance or if I was a mechanic. I mean, this family dinner thing is still, you know, that's church. Yeah. When we invite people in and we're trying to break down those walls between us and them, and so it's a nice thing to have, but it can happen anywhere, anytime.
Well, that's what I loved about that phrase, radically ordinary hospitality, because it makes it so much more accessible. You know what I mean? I think that a lot of the time we think of ministry as being something like, oh, that's, you know, pastors, you do that, you know. But kind of demystifying what that looks like and just being like, okay, it's just literally about kind of doing the things you're already doing, but intentionally showing up in those moments and allowing people to encounter the Holy Spirit in you and cultivating long-term relationships and kind of pressing into just the ordinary nature of it. And I think in a society like ours that puts so much emphasis on the glamour and the fame of, you know, the guy on the stage or whoever it is, that's kind of, I really do believe the Lord is doing something really incredible in the ordinary ways, you know, and bringing genuine revival and transformation to to entire cities through radically ordinary means.
Yeah, in the Greek, the word philosophy, I don't know exactly, but it's a little fuzzy. But I know what it means. It means the love of stranger, and it's either like xenophileo versus xenophobia. Xenophobia, I think, is the fear of stranger.
Yep.
And xenophileo is the love of stranger. Or philoxeno, I don't know
whatever it is.
But that, I mean, hospitality in that sense. Well, all of a sudden, that's a powerful, powerful word that doesn't just mean Southern kind of kindness and all of that and getting your house clean before somebody comes, but it's love of the stranger.
Yeah.
And so that's what we've been, that's what the church should be the best at. Everyone should look to us because we have so many testimonies and stories and examples of that, and people can feel that all around. So that's the idea, is just trying to figure out in moments how we can love the stranger, the orphan, the widow, those who are overlooked or ignored. Is a moment of church, true church.
I love that.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked a lot about this last year and kind of, this family strong concept. I know we're in November now and we're talking about 2020 and beyond. What's on the horizon? I know you're always dreaming about new things, and so I'd love to get a little sneak preview into the coming months and maybe even years ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 2020 is like the perfect year to talk about vision, right?
Of
2020.
course. You have to. I feel like it's a missed opportunity otherwise.
But we're the words that are bouncing around and in our leadership and is spiritual formation. I mean, basically, Christian word for that is discipleship.
Yeah.
But a word that's a little bit more accessible to everybody is the idea of spiritual formation, and that's what we're looking at is trying to create like a little roadmap for that, for people in their own walks to kind of measure against and say, where am I at in my spiritual formation? Whether I'm kind of at I haven't even started stage to where, I've been at this spiritual formation game for a while, but I don't see like I'm making any progress at all. Kind of how do we assess that? How do we stimulate and catalyze maybe some progress, or I know I'm not what I was, but I know I'm not quite what I should be. It's almost like I have gained some, but I know there's more to gain, trying to help people figure that out and get some inspiration and some vision for what's next. So, I mean, we've created some words and terminology, and we've borrowed from other people's roadmaps and books, and so it's taken some shape, but yeah, that's what we're probably going to be focusing on next year, and then trying to organize our staff and our calendar in a way that we're doing a good job of making sure people are being aware of where they are spiritually. You got your body, you've got your soul, mind, and emotions, and then your spirit is the part that God breathed into humanity. Your spirit's the true you. Your spirit's the one that's expressed by your will. Your spirit is the one that lives on after you die. So it's a pretty important reality. Yeah. And I think in our society, we're going to have to spend a lot of time just teaching on the reality of the spirit, because I think people, they're familiar with their body, they're familiar with their mind and emotions, but maybe they haven't given much time and attention to their spirit. Yeah. But the way the Bible teaches is the spirit is primary. So your spirit actually affects your body and your mind and emotions. So if you're out of whack in one of those things, it might be a spiritual problem more so than anything else. So there's going to have to do some work there. And then once you're attuned and aware that you have a spirit, then there's an assessment of, where are you at? And your spirit only comes alive when it encounters the Spirit of Christ. And so there are people who are spiritually dead. And that's a pretty intense thing, because spiritually dead people, once they die, remain spiritually dead. And another word for that is hell, separation from God. But then once you become alive in Christ, then there's a whole process of sanctification. Right. There's a fuller ideology of soteriology, the salvation process. It's not just a moment, it's not just a prayer, but that there's a lot more depth to it. And so, we got our words, awakening, purgation, illumination, and union. Yep. Saved, set free, spirit-filled, and serving. Or I just heard some W's. It was waking, wrestling, working was the last one. I think it was waking, wrestling, waiting and then working. So I don't know. It's fun to kind of put some words to it and try and package it into some phrases that are easy to access. But yeah, our fasting season will kick us off in that direction. And then I really want to teach the book of Hebrews, because there's a lot of the Hebrews was written to Jews who had come to Christ and begun to form, but they were starting to revert back to some religiosity. And so helping people assess that and realize that Hebrews is, really rough at times, really encouraging at times, talking about leaving the elementary parts of the gospel and moving on to more solid, meaningful things. And then I also think about the book of John is just, the Gospels were written, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, very practical, this is who Jesus is. And then John wrote towards the end of his life, maybe 30 years after the other Gospels were written, and kind of brought in this whole spiritual realization, seeing Christ not just as a physical man, but as the deity expressed.
Yeah, right.
And so I just think there's a lot of good spiritual formation stuff in the book of John too.
That's awesome. Well, I appreciate the little sneak peek into what's going to happen in Living Streams in the next year.
Next year's going to be good. We're going to come out of next year, and there's going to be some mighty men and women walking around town.
I love that.
For sure.
That's awesome. Well, beyond that, I mean, we talked a little bit about, the 1 hour of church we're going to have per week. What do you hope to see in the next year in the other hours that people in our own congregation are experiencing, as well as your own family? What do you want to see happen in 2020 in those other hours of life?
Well, along that same paradigm of awakening, purgation, illumination, and union, there's this stage before awakening. And as we assessed our church, this is on the church side of things, we feel like we're pretty strong at the illumination stage, kind of helping people who have already gone through some awakening, and maybe are in the purgation stage. It's a great time to come to Living Streams, because we're all about those things.
Yeah.
And we'll get you from purgation to illumination. And I don't know if we understand union that well. I'm hoping to really do some teaching, and even myself kind of learn what that's all about. Abiding, remaining, kind of that aligning of our hearts, where it's hard to tell if this is God's idea or my idea. Whereas before, it used to be real easy to tell. I know what my idea is, and the opposite was basically God's idea when I first came to Christ. But then that kind of mingling of hearts is a big deal. But then when I look at the before awakening stage, or even at the awakening stage, I just don't think we do a lot, or we pay attention to that very much as a church organization, and maybe not even as the church organism, the people, and just really wanting to remind people that evangelism is a really important part of God's heart, and then multiplication. So if you're a Christian, you multiplication is what Christ, if you're going to follow me, that was the last thing he said. He said, "I want you disciples. Don't miss this. Go and make disciples." So the gospel of Jesus Christ includes you being someone who multiplies. And so I think if we really can emphasize that, leaving the 99, go after the one, God's heart and all of that, my hope is that next year every person in our church will really begin to develop their own philosophy and own practices of evangelism. Not so they can feel better about themselves, not so we can grow the church in numbers, but just because that's the heartbeat of God, that's the heartbeat of Christ, is so missional, is so wanting to leave the 99 to go after the one. And then even our life groups, my dream for life groups is I can't wait till we really get to hear stories about how the life groups are not just filling up with people who already go to church, but they're starting to get filled with some people who don't have any kind of church community or affiliation,
right?
And really be able to stick it to all those statistics that the church is dying, the church is separating from the norms of society. Millennials and whoever comes after that, the Z's,
Gen Z,
are not interested, not connecting, not finding there's any place for them at the church. And it's like, no, man, we got story after story after story. I don't know how risky we can get in here, but we can. I mean, I dream of hearing stories about people who in the LGBT community being a part of our life groups and getting loved on and cared for and submitting themselves to truth and love and seeing what that process undoes or creates in their life. And all the different, groups. Mental illness is such a heavy thing, and I'd love it if we had some space in our life groups for people who are in that vein, and we can figure out how to walk alongside them and their families in that regard, and on and on and on. There's just so many ills in our society, and I think if we can do life groups well, and if we can do our lives well, we'll get people cared for. Foster care is another deal. Like the kids who've aged out of foster care, we're trying to create spaces for them, and I'd love it if that was some life groups, and on and on and on. There's so much going on. What we can do, and yet there is an end into what God is asking of us, so we don't have to do more than we're supposed to. But we definitely have to do our part. Yeah.
What about you personally, David? What do you hope to see happen in your own life in 2020, the year of fresh vision?
No, I'm not moving to Belize in 2020.
That's right. You got a few more years. Do some math here.
Well, I'm very thankful for the job that I have, and I want to do a good job of that. I mean, the team here is so awesome, and I hope to keep helping and serving here at Living Streams. I learned so much this year. I'm into that. I want to learn a bunch next year, even though sometimes you learn things like, oh man, I should have already known that. But I love being a husband and a dad. Brittany and I are 15 years last month.
Congrats.
And I just want to keep, working on communication and working on loving each other and bringing the best out of each other. For my girls, I'm so into what they're doing, whether it's sports, whether it's modeling, like Bella, or just what they're learning in school, and then trying to find teachable moments to say, hey, what's Jesus saying, and help them with the illumination process. And that's been cool to have some little times with them where we'll lead a couple songs and hear what they are talking to Jesus about. It's always so interesting. And then finishing whatever the process is with these foster boys, and hopefully seeing some real good times of them going back home, and then figuring out what it means to walk alongside them still.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though they might not be in our home.
There's a lot on the horizon.
Good books.
Yeah,
we'll definitely go back to Belize and help our friends down there.
Yeah,
but maybe a little road trip this summer.
That'd be great.
We love road trips, and we got that giant van now.
Got to take advantage of that for sure.
Advantage of that.
Yes, sir. So before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to share, David? Anything that's on your heart the Lord's kind of been stirring in you while you've got this chance? We got the microphones and the cameras and everything.
No, I mean, my imagine is that most people that are listening to this are a part of Living Streams, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being a part of what the Lord's doing. Thank you for all the encouragement. And thank you for the work that you're doing in your own spiritual formation. It's total joy to be here. I just preached at another church, and they're cool and all, but I'm like, whatever. I really do love it here. I love this family. I love what our potential is. I love the gains that we've made. And it's an honor. It's a joy to be a part of this staff. And I know people have to live with a little bit of my stink, just all of my weaknesses. They show up throughout every part of the church now, which is kind of interesting. But people are still sticking around, and that's fun. But no, let's just keep going. Let's just keep pushing it and seeing if we can, gain all that the Lord has in mind for us, because He's got a lot.
I love that. That's so good. Well, David, I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate you carving some time out to make this happen. It's been a joy and an honor to have you on as well. And this has been great, man.
We should do this more often.
We should do this more often. I love it. So good. Well, but on a serious note, that's a legitimate possibility. We could probably make that happen a couple more times.
I'll have to interview you after your time in Ecuador.
Ecuador? Yeah, that's right. So who knows, man, where this might all end up. But it's been fun. I've enjoyed the last 45 minutes or so. So Anyways, thank you all so much for watching this podcast. For those of you who are part of Living Streams, we just want to echo what David said. Thank you for being a part of this family. If you're not a part of Living Streams and you've somehow stumbled upon this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you continue to get updated with similar content. And make sure to hit up livingstreams.org and livingstreams.online for content that is specifically designed for people like you. So once again, thank you. We'll see you next time.